It's a gloomy, rainy day in Boulder, Colorado. I've spent this week getting cortisone shots in my shoulders, which are now bone on bone and inoperable because of my age and physical condition. And I also got a Botox injection this morning on my eyelid, which droops so that the eyelashes scratch my eyeball. The only comment I can make is the shit's growing old, but I guess there's not much I can do about it. So, I posted a lengthy article on my blog, Dennis Comments, the other day about Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby was the strip club owner in Dallas that was shown on television shooting Lee Harvey Oswald, who was accused of assassinating John Kennedy. Lots of interesting stuff going on around that time in that place. The chief of police was a guy named Cabal, C-A-B-A-L, whose brother was a high-ranking CIA agent. There was all kinds of troop training going on to invade Cuba and things like that. The reason that I brought the Jack Ruby thing up is years ago I had a couple clients that were allegedly in an organized crime ring out of Denver. One of them was sort of a star client. He had 80 some arrests and no convictions. It made me look really good. I don't think it was my fault, but I'm not going to turn down the praise, etc. He also was one of the first persons in the nation to get charged with travel in aid of racketeering. He and a buddy had gaming licenses and gaming stamps. This was in the 60s, and when Congress enacted the Racketeering Act, or RICO, they prosecuted him for going across the state line to engage in a crap game in a livestock auction barn in Nebraska. And identical to the situation in Leary, they got convicted with the gaming license shown as evidence of their intent to gamble. And since they crossed the state line, that was crossing a state line in aid of a racketeering enterprise, therefore they were prosecuted. That was the second case I lost in the U.S. Supreme Court. But it was an interesting experience, and at that time I thought it was interesting that the Racketeering or RICO Act hadn't been brought against any dope dealers. That was until I recognized the influence and impact of the CIA's activity in that arena. Anyway, these two gentlemen, one of them owned this DC-3, and he used it to fly guns back and forth to Cuba. He worked for Jack Ruby when Jack Ruby was tied in with the Chicago outfit. Also, that's where the Minlaker rifle allegedly used to shoot John Kennedy came from, was a gun shop in Chicago. And Chicago had kind of an interesting tie-in with all of this. It's where I went to law school, by the way. In any event, these two clients were smuggling rifles and other weaponry to Cuba, and they were supplying both Batista and Castro. If you recall ancient history, Castro defeated Batista, and all of the mafia gambling enterprises got thrown out of Cuba, and they were pretty much run by Santos Traficante out of Florida and Carlos Marcello out of New Orleans. But Chicago had their hand in the pie also. Now the interesting thing about this is that they were bringing back heroin, which they used to trade, or to get cash to trade for more weaponry. And that pretty much sounds familiar. One of their best friends was a CIA operative in South Vietnam prior to the fall of Dien Bien Phu. And at that time, the American intelligence community was essentially stepping in, taking over the French position, the French intelligence agency's position. They were fighting a large communist movement in France with the front there, and the United States government was paranoid that the communists would take over, and so they decided to help France out. They helped France out by taking over their heroin market or their opium market, and that at the time when Marseille was a big heroin capital and a lot of shipping between Saigon and Marseille was occurring. The French Foreign Legion was the big force in both Vietnam and Algeria. If you recall, at that time there was also the Algerian Revolt and a General's Revolt and the Colonel's Revolt and all kinds of bullshit like that going on, plus an assassination story regarding a guy named Carlos the Jackal. Now I know this is a little bit hard to take and digest, but you're just going to have to go to the library and read a little bit, because this is all printed and docketed and documented and substantiated. But anyway, these guys were helping out the war effort on both sides, which isn't untypical of American participation in weapons sales. At the same time, there was a fellow a couple years ahead of me in graduate school named Robert K. Brown, who was an aide to General Singlaub of the Phoenix Project, and he was recruiting mercenaries, privateers or whatever you want to call them, to go to Cuba and help with the Cuban invasion, which was centered around Texas, Louisiana, and other southern states where they were training for the invasion. So, having studied that with many others for half a century, I'm still not too sure what exactly did happen. My best guess is there was a lot of agencies and a lot of different people involved, and it was a structural thing rather than conspiratorial. But the end result was that we took over the heroin operation in Southeast Asia, and it was run pretty much by the military. A case that I worked on in New Mexico exposed them packing heroin into corpses, shipping the corpses from Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base in Saigon to Travis Air Force Base in California, and from there to Albuquerque Sandia Base in New Mexico, and then up the San Luis Valley into Pueblo, which became a major heroin distribution point in the late 60s, early 70s. But I'm digressing. I got these two clients that were working for Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby at that time definitely was working for Army intelligence. He was also hooked up with the Chicago, what they call the outfit, which was the terminology for organized crime in Chicago. Somehow this got around to where it played out in the Nixon administration. If you recall, the godfather of Chicago was going to testify in front of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and he was under 24-hour guard, and a dispatcher called the policemen that were guarding him and told him to take a coffee break, and somebody went into Giancana's house and shot him twice in the back of the head during that time period. the day before he was to have testified in front of the Senate committee. Another Chicagoan named Roselli was supposed to testify, and he's the one that set up a couple assassination attempts by the so-called mafia to assassinate Castro. His body was found cut in half in an oil drum floating in the Bay of Biscayne in Miami. So there's a lot of mysterious deaths going around here, and who the hell knows what goes on. But what I do know is that this thing smacks of intelligence operations. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about in my coming videos. I'm going to try to publish as much as I can in my blog, which is denniscomments.wordpress.com, where I'll give the evidentiary stuff. I'm not going to try to show it in videos, mainly because I don't know how the hell to do it. And secondly, I'm lazy, and thirdly, I'm too old, and I guess you can't teach an old dog new tricks, mainly because I'm not inclined to do so. So on the next thing, we'll talk a little bit about Jack Ruby, and we'll talk about some other people in Chicago, and then we're going to get to the article that I published about Pody Poe. That was a racketeering case that I was involved in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was a group of gamblers, mostly executives from various Oklahoma oil companies, that were betting big time on football games and screwing up the mafia's fixing. So I wanted to publish that article about Pody Poe first, so that you could read that and have some idea what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the bookmaking with the NFL and football games and the Oklahoma Tulsa gambling syndicate, which was actually anti-syndicate. And I think now that I've confused you enough, I'll sign off. This is the accumulation of a lot of my experience. As many of you know, I not only represented various intelligence operatives in ONI and CIA, but also organized crime figures throughout the country, hippies, drug dealers, etc. I never really intended to practice law. I just did that and mainly used it as a launching pad to do some sociological research that I've been involved with for about half of a decade. And because of that, I would appreciate it very much if you guys would write comments, criticisms, nasty letters, whatever, just to get an idea of how this is going over and what impact I'm having or not having, and how much you hate or like whatever I'm doing. So, I hope all of you women or you ladies out there had a good Mother's Day. Arlene had a fairly good Mother's Day. I slept. And rather than going out, we went to one of our favorite steakhouses and got meals to go, which was our limited celebration. So with that, I'll say goodbye.